start recording. But I'm so excited to begin our Criminal Justice Diversity and Law guest speaker event for February 2023. And I would love to introduce our guest speaker. You can talk a little bit about yourself.
So good evening. First of all, I want to thank you all for having me. I laugh. I was talking to one of my colleagues that I was with earlier today, and this is literally the fourth speaking engagement that I've had today. But they've all been about different subjects, but they all come around to the same thing. And it talks to and speaks to my passion for our legal system and criminal justice. I am Professor Phyllis Kotey. You'll hear people refer to me as Judge Phyllis, because along with being a clinical professor of law here at FIU, I'm also a senior judge, which means that I sit as a judge on cases when they need coverage. And I have the ability to do that anywhere in the state of Florida. Prior to becoming a judge, I was a prosecutor in Gainesville, Florida, and became a full-time judge there before becoming a senior judge and coming to FIU to teach in 2004 when the law school was just new. So my area has always been that of ethics, criminal law, criminal justice reform. I teach a class right now called Police Practices and Procedures in the 21st Century. So I like looking at issues as they occur and as they affect us as a system.
That is amazing. You're literally such an awesome guest speaker to have. For students who are coming in, our topic for the year is police reform. So what we've been doing this entire school year has been discussing this and unpacking this and hear from different people and academics about their views on it. So who better than Professor Kotey and Judge? So one of our big questions for you is, how did you get into law? What drew you into law and learning about criminal justice from your point of view?
Right. So it's kind of weird because what got me there is what keeps me here now. Right now, I'm director of externships and pro bono programs here at FIU, along with teaching. When I was in high school, there was a program called the Executive High School Internship Program. And I wanted to, I wasn't sure whether I wanted to be a doctor or a lawyer. So I did vocational training and I did the training to become an intern. So I interned and I had to pick, and I picked the state attorney because I thought the state attorney were the people that represent the state attorneys that represent people. Because my thought was I was going to represent all these people who were falsely accused by our system and how people get locked up. Lo and behold, I began that as a high school student and realized the prosecutor's office is that place where people that prosecute people, that bring the charges, that are responsible for making that decision. I also saw it as a place of great power, and realize that people think that as a person of color, as a person who's affected by criminal justice, I don't want to be that prosecutor. But the thing I always tell people is that you have the opportunity as the prosecutor to not prosecute, to drop those charges. And I saw the awesome amount of power that existed in it. And that's what I wanted to do. So I then went to undergrad because I also worked as a medical transcriptionist. I thought doctor, lawyer, and I realized, oh, this law stuff seems like much more fun. But the entire time I was an undergrad, I was a political science and theater major, but I only wanted to be a prosecutor. I went to law school. I only interned at the prosecutor's office. I only took criminal law classes. I don't necessarily suggest this because it would have been awful had I been wrong, and I did not love it as much as I did. But yet I became a prosecutor, certainly with the thought that I was going to become the first Black female prosecutor in the state of Florida, the state attorney. But life took me a different way, and I became a judge and now a professor. So that's kind of the long and short of how I got here. And I must say, being a prosecutor was all that I thought it would be, including the politics. It is very difficult, but it is a position of great power when it's held by people with an ethical lens in terms of doing the right thing, because we see misuses all the time.
That was an amazing answer. That leads me back into, why is it important that we see diversity and inclusion represented within the criminal justice system through lawyers, through judges, and in your point of view, how important is that?
I think it's of utmost importance. I mean, I think I've said that one of my areas is judicial ethics. And one of the things I talk about in presenting issues of judicial ethics is how it's important that people appear in front of people that look like them sometimes. I mean, we've had an entire system that's operated where the majority of the stakeholders, or at least the people making those important decisions, or the judges, were white men. And we never once questioned the legitimacy of a system that did not have people that looked like everyone in our system. But what we have found as we've expanded that pool is that injustices exist. And sometimes injustices exist just because we aren't aware or don't have knowledge of who people are, because that's not our life experience. So it's certainly one of the things that I think we bring to the table when we talk about diversity and judges. When I began as a prosecutor, I was one of 2 women, and there were no Black people in the state attorney's office. When I became a judge in Gainesville and ran for judge, I was the first Black female that had ever been a judge. And that was 1998. It's really not that long ago. And we now see studies everywhere that talk about the inequity in our system, and much of it tied to what people look like, what people sound like. And that's why it's important that we have every aspect of representation in all levels. I mean, when I became a prosecutor, people will tell me, Black people don't become prosecutors. Why are you doing that? Yeah, I have a colleague, right, who's here with me. He's always bothering me about, how can you work for the man? I can't believe you're a prosecutor. You need to get rid of that prosecutor lens. But it is important for us to be everywhere at all times. And I think it has a lot of legitimacy to the system. I know the number of times I was at the table that my presence made a difference in terms of how the state reacted to the particular case.
Are there any cases that impacted your career deeply that you look back on and you're like, okay, the choices I made, like we can study all day, right? But in certain situations, your ethics do play a role, and that's unique to the person. So how do you balance your ethics as well as your views on law?
You have to do that with an understanding and an appreciation of what our laws are. And there are 2 cases that come to mind for me, and one was a relatively minor one in the scheme of things for other people. The anti-apartheid movement, you all are too young to really know that there were a lot of protests, and there were student-led protests about South Africa and the apartheid movement and the separation of people by races, and people were arrested. And being the only Black prosecutor in the state attorney's office, of course, I was assigned the case to prosecute those people who had who were arrested for protesting. And they happened to fall in my alphabet, but the state attorney said, I didn't care whose alphabet they fell in, you were getting the cases. So, and I remember the trial in one of the cases of a young woman. And during the cross-examination, she talked, when I said, and you violate the law, you knew it was against the law to interrupt, and you interrupted. She said, if someone hadn't protested for you, you'd still be a slave. To which I said, exactly. But people paid for those decisions, didn't they? And in paying for those decisions, they had to be responsible for the choices that they made, just like you have to be responsible for the choices that you made. And and people did say to me, how can you? I said, it's against the law. She interrupted a school function. Kids were performing. And again, while I believe every single thing in terms of what she was fighting for, as I said to her, or said in my closing, Martin Luther King paid a price for his beliefs. He went to jail. I'm not saying he was a criminal, but he certainly went to jail because there were laws that, right or wrong, were being used against him. And then the other part of what I did during the later part of my life as a prosecutor, and it's much more somber, is the fact that I was what they called a capital sexual battery prosecutor, which means I prosecuted cases of kids who had been raped for 12 years and under. And it weighed on me, the weight of those decisions and the weight of a trial in terms of what happens to children when we take them through that. And I forever wanted to make sure, first of all, that if we're doing a trial, that we're going to do this once. So I really tried to pay careful attention to the ethical rules, the evidentiary rules, the procedural rules, so that we wouldn't do this again. So I cringe when I look at television sometimes and look at the violations that take place and the things that people think we can do that I know legally and ethically we cannot do. But it made a difference, so that I I always wanted to do things the right way because I never wanted to have to do it again or put victims through that more than once.
Absolutely. One of the first classes I personally took was victimology for criminal justice because it was important to understand how law and everything connects back to victims and people. Court is about people. This is sometimes the worst day of their life, you know, so you have to keep that in mind. And everything we learn, we take from a perspective. Not everything's going to be like an example of a textbook. Some things are going to be unique, you know,
Absolutely.
and do you feel like your perspective within law, right? Do you ever look towards like in the next 5 years, I would like to see this in law so that I can see more diversity and inclusion? Is there anything in the next 5 years you think about and you're like, if I saw this, I would know that things have changed?
You know, what I really would like to see is more equitable sentencing alternatives. And a lot of that is the product of our system in terms of how it works and what happens. But I have an example that stands out in my mind, but there's nothing I can really do to change it. When I began sitting as a judge in Broward, I would get these cases all the time of drug offenders, and they were first-time drug offenders, and for many of them, you know, it's treated as a deferred. It's the same way I treated it when I was a prosecutor. We put them on a deferred prosecution, they pay, and the record disappears. But I noticed that a lot of the individuals of color that were appearing in front of me, we would do a time served misdemeanor plea as opposed to the deferred prosecution. And I finally said to the lawyers as a counsel, I just don't understand. And I didn't want to accept the pleas. And I would question, why are all the Black people getting a time served plea and all the seemingly white people getting the deferred prosecution? And finally, the defense attorney said, Judge, because they were stopping the pleas sometimes because of the question I asked. And he said, look, my clients don't want to be on paper. They think that if they're on probation, he said, not even think, they know that if they're on probation, that police officers will continue to hound them, they'll continue to bother them, and they'll end up spending much more time and paying much more seriously for this offense than they would if we just close it so that it can't be brought back up. And I wanted to be able to say to them, that's not true. That's not, you know, that's not valid. You know, give them the opportunity to get the deferred so that they can have the education, you know, because you don't get college loans if you have drug convictions. But I knew that they were right. And I knew that it was true. And I knew, even as a prosecutor, I mean, I didn't mind a deferred because I was like, if you get in trouble again, we get you for this crime and the new crime. But that was a reality, and a reality to such an extent that it played out in ways that look racist, but certainly was racial in terms of how we had to deal with it.
Do you feel like, from what you've said, when you look at the criminal justice system, when you went from your undergrad and then you discovered your love for law and your love for all that it is, do you feel like what your students are learning from your lessons and your teachings, how do they maybe bring that into their careers? Do you feel like they're learning about, you know, unpacking certain elements of race and criminal justice and law? Do you feel like that kind of plays a role in their careers and how they approach law?
I mean, I would love to say that it plays a role in all their careers, but no, I mean, I think it doesn't in every single one. I think you have to make a decision to a decision about which part of our system you want to participate in. I mean, part of being a criminal justice practitioner is that I was never going to get rich doing this. I mean, you know, certainly being a prosecutor and becoming a judge it's a solid living, but you know, at the end of the day, it still is a state living. And we operate right now in a climate and an environment that makes it very difficult sometimes to have discussions, frank discussions about race and bias and diversity. Now, I think I'm able to fairly successfully cross that divide by using my courses really to talk about what I call is intentional justice. And when I call it intentional justice, what I really am telling them is, you know, what are the voluntary and intentional things that you are doing or saying that's creating social change by addressing, you know, either racial or social injustice. And I think I can ask a question like that without violating any laws, but invite students to think critically about what they're seeing and about what they're experiencing. For example, yesterday we looked at the video of the officers that that now are being investigated by the police or the Citizens Review Committee, and here in Miami-Dade. And the officer is seen grabbing the throat of the individual, and then another officer is seen while the person is handcuffed on the ground, pulling him up. I mean, so it's going up, he's handcuffed, and dragging him that way. And the individual is not seen doing anything in terms of resistance or any sort of way. And I don't think I have to say anything when I show a video like that to my students to ask, what do you see? You know, what is the problem and what is happening? And it's not an issue of color necessarily when you look at those kinds of things. And in this particular case, you know, the officers were Black. So it's not always, I think, necessary for us to be in your face about issues of bias and how situations are handled in terms of our criminal justice system. Unfortunately, I think life itself provides us with enough examples that we can use both locally and nationwide.
I think that is such an interesting analysis of how individual students, their ethics, their point of views, their privilege, all these things play a role in law enforcement, in judges. Like my grandfather was a judge, right? The way he may have approached law was coming from the perspective of, you know, his experiences, his interpretation of law. But then the way you may approach law and your interpretation may be very different, even though you're referring to the same thing, you know?
Right, and I tell people, no, we're shaped by our own life experiences. Because one of the things, I wholeheartedly believed in attorneys trying their own cases, so I try not to interfere. But I could not ignore case after case where I'm looking at, you know, a Black young man being treated one way and another young man being treated a different way. And eventually I allowed these things to happen because it was to their benefit, and to, you know, as their attorneys have pointed out, for me to let them have the cases happen. But it's a much more serious, I think, indictment of our criminal justice system that we have to allow, or we have something like that happening.
I was going to ask, when you look back on your experiences in law and you becoming a judge and you going into this career, what is some advice you would give students pursuing law, you know, now in their undergrad? What is something that you would give them advice on? If you could look back and someone could have given you that advice, what advice would you want to give now?
I mean, I think the route that I took is a good one in terms of trying to intern as many and get as much experiential education as you can, because I think that's really important. I also think it's important to not necessarily, and I want to hope that I wasn't nearly as closed as I think I probably was. And what if I was wrong and I decided another aspect of the law that I like? I have a niece that became a lawyer, and she ended up going to the University of Florida just like I did, but wanted absolutely nothing to do with the criminal justice system. You know, and she does really well as a commercial lawyer, you know, making a whole lot more money. So I think it is important to remain open. It's great to have plans. It's great to think about that's what you want to do, but experience it. You know, intern, get a job. I had a plan. If I hadn't gotten into law school, my plan was to become a police officer. And then I was going to use, or a probation officer, and I was going to use that to pay for law school, or until I was able to get in law school. So I've always, you know, kind of dealt with having 2 or 3 plans, even with the life plan. And when the other thing happens, I go, obviously that's what was supposed to happen.
I love that perspective. So, you know, coming out of that advice, it would be to have different routes and different plans. If something, you know, doesn't go the way you thought it would. Also being more open-minded. We've heard that from a lot of,
absolutely.
We spoke to the NSA recently. We've spoken to someone involved with the FBI. A lot of people have been saying that, you know, keep an open mind to different approaches in your career, different roles. Don't be set on one thing, because that may change, and that's perfectly
exactly fine. And what if you're wrong? I mean, even in terms of athletics and sports, I mean, so I have 3 kids, and I want to say forced, but they had to do well academically. I had them doing something artistic, and then something athletic. And I told them, I don't care if you're good at these things, but I want you to experience these things. And, you know, fortunately for them, each of them kind of excelled in different ways, but it also made them well-rounded for college. And I think it's made them much better practitioners in terms of who they are. You know, I have a son who's a therapist, and is doing work on multi-generational cultural trauma and dealing with that. You know, I have a daughter that's a midwife, nurse practitioner, nurse midwife, that delivers babies. And then my oldest, who actually, you know, is fluent in Japanese. And if I hadn't forced them to just be exposed, I mean, don't close yourself off. Don't think just because you can't see it, it can't be imagined and it can't happen.
What are some characteristics that you feel like you would have to go into a career like this, being a judge, being a lawyer, even being a professor? What are some personal characteristics you think someone should have? Should they be driven? Should they be, inquisitive, you know?
I mean, I think all of those are good. I think what's important more than anything else for any career, and I say this is for being a judge, for being a professor, for being a teacher, is you got to be passionate. I mean, I just can't imagine people who do a job and they hate what they do, and they hate every day going to work. And I think back to, I worked as a medical transcriptionist, and for me at that time, it was not a profession but a job. But I still made sure that I wanted to be the best. I wanted to be the best medical transcriptionist there was. Every single thing I did, I tried to do it well or to set myself apart. And I think that's the important thing, is having a sense of pride and passion about what you do and doing things with that kind of conviction, because I think it passes along in terms of it.
That was an awesome answer. I'm so grateful that you were a guest speaker, because it's important to have these conversations,
Absolutely.
Obviously this month is Black History Month, but every month is about a different community, and we all live in this skin and we all live through our perspectives. Do you have any personal advice for students who may be, interested in law? Do you think that there's any ways you can like dip your toe into that interest? Like you said that with your undergrad, you were in theater, right? How would you advise students who, are interested? Can they email you? Do you think there's anyone?
Oh, absolutely. And I said, yeah, I actually majored in political science and theater. And I'm right here at the law school. My office is right on the first floor. They can certainly email me, although I have 120,000 emails.
Absolutely. Do you, does your office?
But I will get to them and I will look at them, or just keep emailing me. But stopping by the law school, making an appointment, calling, making an appointment, coming by, setting up a Zoom. I do Zoom appointments all the time. All of those are good things. I like to talk to students about their perspective, thoughts about becoming lawyers, going to law school, the importance of having a plan. I speak to a lot of students now who want to go to our law school, and they won't necessarily have the grades and the LSAT scores to do it. But I tell them there are other law schools, and you can always transfer here after that first year. I said, just always, have a plan. There's nothing wrong with having 2 or 3 plans, and whichever one seems to work out, that's what you're supposed to be doing. But I love talking to students. I love talking to groups like this, and having that opportunity to kind of spark that knowledge in students. I think it's so important. Find a role model. There are so many excellent professors that on campus. There are a lot of lawyer professors, like in criminal justice, who are lawyers and not necessarily practicing, and SIPA, who are lawyers and not necessarily practicing. But even, just any professor, I think having a mentor is so important, because they help plant those seeds in terms of the kinds of things that you can do and the possibilities. And I think that is just so important in terms of who we are.
Absolutely. Does anyone have any questions for our amazing guest speaker? If you don't feel comfortable, they can always put it in the chat, and I will ask those questions if that's preferred for you. Also, my treasurer Felix and my secretary Melissa is here, so if anyone has any questions, please unmute yourselves. I'm going to stop the recording here.